Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're going to start things off today with Nagash, the Supreme Lord of the Undead, and we're going to start this model off by applying a layer of Vallejo earth texture to the base, some Citadel skulls, and some leftover zombie bits from the Flesh Eater quartz. Then, base the whole thing in Gracier. Once everything's dry, we're going to touch all the Vallejo earth texture with Agros Dunes. This is going to give it a nice earthy look to it. If you do something like this, be sure and take care around all the little bits that you've glued on or stuck into the paste. I really recommend doing a dab of super glue over everything, just to kind of solidify and cement everything in place. There were a couple of bits on here that were a little bit too loose, and I ended up having to super glue them after the fact. So to prevent that, just kind of super glue before you base coat and you shouldn't have any issues. Once that's done, we're going to grab our skeleton horde, and there are a lot of bony bits on this model. We've got part of the belt itself, his chest, the back. You get the idea. There's a lot of sections of bone. We're just going to touch all those up with skeleton horde. Now, if you're using contrast paints, you're going to want to be a little bit careful to not have much spillover. There's a lot of details on this model, and if you don't want to have to go back and do dozens of little touch-up bits, a little bit less paint and a few extra minutes spent going over areas is going to do you a lot of good. I had a little spillover on a few areas of this model, and trying to go through with a fine tip brush to paint over things with Gracier to do touch-ups is not exactly fun. I decided to do the knee and kind of foot pads here in the skeleton horde as well, since they kind of looked like rib cages. And his headdress was very interesting. We have a couple of rows of skulls with some what look like rib bones coming out the top. So I did those in the skeleton horde and tried my best not to touch the other areas. Go over the face and the kind of spine-looking beard, and we should be good. Next, we're going to grab Shyish Purple, and this is going to be used to coat his chest plate as well as his leg armor. There's a lot of little nooks and crannies with this armor, and this is one of those sections that I feel like I should have painted before assembling the model, but doing that, you always run the risk of the fumes from the superglue kind of tainting the coloration of the model. So I went with a calculated choice to assemble then paint instead of paint then assemble. If you happen to have an angle brush like I use later on in the video, it helps with a lot of the hard to reach detail areas. And now for some quick touches on his headdress. Now there's some detail parts here that I kind of just paint over, but you can leave them and do with a detail brush in between them if you like. Alright, so now we're going to use Nagash Purple, and this is going to be some of the cloth fabric detail work on the headdress, and then we will eventually be using it for other areas of the model. Now this paint goes on fairly thin, so if you want a slightly more even coat, I would recommend 2 light coats as opposed to 1 medium or even heavy coat. Since it is a contrast paint, it will pool and have darker shades if you're not careful. Now we're going to use some Basilicanum Gray. We don't use a whole lot of this paint on this model, but we're going to use it to paint these little fins on the staff. Now we're going to go back to the Nagash Purple, and we're going to do a little bit of touches on the headdress, kind of painting over a couple areas that I had missed the first time around. And there's a few little kind of air bubbles that popped and left some unpainted spaces on the armor, so we're going to touch those up as well. And now we're going to use a color blending method to do the cloth coming off of his arms. We're going to start things off with Nagash Purple and then blend it with some Nagash Purple. Now to do this, you really want to have a fairly heavy coat. Like you can see the pools of paint on the edges of the cloth here. Now you want that to stay as wet as possible, so I have both pots open off to the side, and as soon as I've got the area painted that I want, I can quickly switch to the Shyish Purple and just kind of dab that on so that the paints blend together. Kind of creating a almost blended two-tone look for some edges of the cloth. And now we're going to do that on the other side. Now on this side there's a section of cloth that you can see through the mouth of the open skull shoulder pad, so make sure you don't miss that section. And again with the Shyish Purple, while everything is still wet. And that is that. Now we're going to do the same thing on the rest of his cloak, but we're going to add in Nighthaunt Gloom at the end. Now again, the important part is to make sure that the paint stays wet, so the upper sections of the robe I'm going to paint kind of quickly and then focus a lot more towards the end at the blended sections. So I'm doing a quick coat of the Megos Purple, making sure that I have some paint pools towards the bottom section that I want, quickly switch to the Shyish Purple, and paint down and then up into the other sections. And then to make sure I don't get the paints mixed together in the paint pots, I do a quick brush off, grab some fresh paint, and then go again. Now if you want this to blend a lot more than what I have here, kind of hold the model on its side and let the paints kind of flow together. And as you can see, the paints are already blending together quite nicely. Contrast paints are fairly forgiving in their use, but don't let them fool you. They will dry a lot faster than you'd expect. So if you try this, remember the paint has to be as wet as you can get it. So there is another method to do this with a contrast medium, but I have not tried that method, so I can't tell you how well it works. Alright, now we switch to the Nighthaunt Gloom, and this actually blended a lot nicer than I had originally expected. By having the extra pooling of the Shyish Purple, it really gives the effect like his cloak is bleeding into the etheric energies that are surrounding him. Just a quick extra pool of the Shyish Purple so that it blends properly, and back into the Nighthaunt Gloom. Now as you can see, there is a lot of kind of spectral energy along this model, so the rest of that is going to get painted in the Nighthaunt Gloom. This will also allow the cloak to fully dry, and we won't have to worry about the paints running or smudging together if we happen to touch them. And with a couple of quick touches to finish up the wraiths that are floating around him, we can switch to an angled brush to get the inside of the cloak. Now I'm using the same blending method to kind of tie everything together, but the nice part about the interior of cloaks on models like this is you don't necessarily have to do the full blending if you don't want to. I actually did half the blending on the upper sections of the cloak and full blending on the lower sections, since those will be more noticeable. But the upper cloak on the inside you won't really see unless you're picking up the model and turning it over. So I kind of did a half blending, so anything towards the front of the model is fully blended, anything towards the back that are covered by the legs I did not blend as much. And now we're going to use Plaguebearer Flesh. Now we have a few of the Flesh Eater Quartz models that I had leftover bits for. They are now clawing their way out of the base of the model. So I decided to try some Plaguebearer Flesh, which I haven't used before really, and see how that would look on the models. Now we're going to switch to a light dry brush of Iron Warriors. This is going to go over the armored sections with the Shyish Purple. This will give it kind of a nice little armor sheen without doing a really heavy coat. And now we're going to use some Balthazar Gold. We have a lot of little detail areas on this model, and we're going to hit most of them up with this. So we're going to start things off with the shoulder pads, kind of anywhere around the bony areas and the Shyish Purple. This will give a nice framework for the model, as well as a good contrasting color to use to kind of tie everything together. I also like this color because it's kind of a muted, dull gold, as opposed to some of the brighter ones. And since he is the Lord of Undead, I feel like this is a better color choice. And now we're going back to the Skeleton Horde. There's a few areas on the staff here that I thought would look kind of nice with a detailed skeleton bone, as well as the shaft, and some of the other sections get a little bit of a touch-up. Now I'm doing a somewhat heavy coat on this little arch of skulls, and then a somewhat light coat on the rest. Now you can easily make the bone sections darker and more pronounced by doing a second coat, or you can do a thinner coat and have them be very, very faded with time. And now we're going to use some Parchment coloration from the Artisan Loft style of paints. This is just a flat acrylic that I use for all the book edges and anything that's paper. And now we're going to switch over to Snakebite Leather. This is going to be used to paint the sheath on his sword and a couple of the covers for the books. now we're going to switch to Guilliman Flesh, and this is going to do a kind of medium coat over the Plaguebearer flesh. What I'm going for is kind of a dry, aged, leathery skin look, which I'm not entirely sure if I've got quite right, but we'll see what we can do about that later. Now we're going to use some Grey Knight steel, and this is going to be used to paint all of the chains that are kind of wrapped around the books. And we'll also use it to paint some of the details on the scabbard. Now the book in his hand has this nice little skull insignia on the front, so we're going to paint that in this as well. Next we switch back to the Guilliman Flesh. There is a few of the books that have a kind of wrapped leather cover and binding, so we're going to paint those in the Guilliman Flesh to kind of give it the appearance that as the Lord of Undead he's using whatever happens to be on hand to kind of bind his books. So these are bound and wrapped in the skin and flesh of fallen enemies. Next, we're going to use some Black Templar. Some of the other books kind of look like they have a metal cover, so we're going to paint those with this. And now using some Grey Seer, we're going to touch up a couple of the areas that kind of have a little bit too much extra paint. And now back to the Grey Knight steel, we're going to paint the knives that these wraiths are holding. And then follow it up with finishing off a couple of the chains and locks that we missed before. As well as these little elbow pads. Now we're going to switch to Retributor armor. This is a much brighter gold than the Balthazar gold, so we're going to use it to touch up a few of the remaining areas on his staff. Now, I'm going to try and be very careful on this one because I'm using the gold to paint the stitching on his sword scabbard, kind of giving the idea that he had this made with golden thread. And then touching a few of the spines on the books and a couple sections of the trim. When it comes to these books, I find it very important to have a lot of variety when it comes to their paint schemes. I don't think it would look as nice if all of the books were painted exactly the same, which is why I'm doing so much variation with them. And now jumping back to the Balthazar Gold, we're going to finish up a couple other areas, such as this large skull that's in the center of the staff, and a few of the sections on the books. Now we go back to the Skeleton Horde for a touch-up on all of the skulls that are on the base. Now looking back, I think I would have done the sand on the base in a slightly different color, maybe kind of a lighter color, because everything does seem to blend together a lot more than I had wanted. And while we have the Skeleton Horde, we're going to do the spine and bony bits on a couple of the remaining books. While we're at it, we're going to hit up a couple areas that I completely missed for the entirety of the painting of the model. And we're going to do a second coat of Guilliman flesh on all the clawing zombie bits. Still didn't quite get the coloration I wanted, but off camera I did a dry brush of kind of a lightish pink, and that got me the coloration that I wanted. And switch back to Balthazar Gold for some final finishing touches. And here we are with the finished piece. Alright everyone, so this was Nagash, Supreme Lord of the Undead. This was a ton of fun to paint, and I'm really looking forward to handing this off to a friend of mine who asked me to paint it for him. So, thank you everyone for watching. Please hit that like button, subscribe for future content, comment in the comments section, let me know how I'm doing, and I will see you in the next one.